This morning's reading is from Genesis, chapter 12, verses 1 to 7. And that can be found on page 13 of the church Bibles in front of you. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife, Sarai, and his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And so he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him.
Thank you very much, Ali. It'd be great if you could keep Genesis 12 open in front of you. Just a quick introduction on a couple of things. We're going through the whole Bible story over these next few weeks. If you'd like to read some more, this great book, God's Big Picture, on the bookstall, follows a very similar approach and will just enable you to unpack it in a little bit more detail. Another thing to remind you of is that the children and young people are also going through the same kind of material at about the same time as us. So when you're at home with them, those of you here who are parents, do share with them what you've learned and ask them what they've learned. Maybe even a good thing, just as we go through, to just write down 2 or 3 things that as parents you want to talk through with your kids when you get home. The other thing to say is that during this series, there's an opportunity for, particularly for people who are not yet convinced about Christianity, to meet me during the week afterwards and just engage on the material. Come with your questions, your objections. I haven't got all the answers, but it would be fun to explore them together. It's a little bit tricky this week because of real lives, but hopefully it's going to come back on the screen. There we are. After real lives on Tuesday, Tuesday evening, 9:05, up at the Giddy Bridge. I'll be there. Come and meet round a drink and a table, and we'll enjoy some dialogue together. So if you're not a Christian, you're not yet convinced, please come and give me your feedback, and let's engage. One of the first cars that I ever drove was a little Mini that belonged to my dad. And I had some adventures in this little Mini. There was one occasion where I was driving about half an hour to work in the morning during student holidays. And when I set off, there was no petrol showing on the petrol gauge. It looked completely empty. But I thought, well, let's see how far we can go. So I drove all the way to work, about half an hour, and I got there. And so at the end of the day, I had this dilemma. Should I fill it up before I come home? Or, well, wouldn't it be really cool to say that I got all the way there and all the way back on no petrol? And then Dad could fill it up the next day and I wouldn't have to pay. So that's what I tried to do. But unfortunately, it ran out 5 miles from home and I had to go and find some. But you know, when I bothered to keep fuel in the tank of this little Mini, it was pretty cool. So take a look at the screen to see what you can do in a Mini. Isn't that cool, yeah? That was just after I put some petrol back in the car. Now, in case you don't know, that's what's known in the trade as a handbrake turn, okay? And it seems to me to be a great kind of image to help us get into Genesis chapter 12. Let me explain. We're doing this journey through the whole of the Bible story, and we began back at creation. Can we just have the next slide coming up, if it will? There we are. We began back at creation and at the good world that God made. And then last week, we looked at that moment when everything went wrong. We called it decreation. And the goodness of creation began to unravel when human beings rejected God and tried to put themselves in his place. That was chapter 3 of Genesis. And the result of that disastrous choice was that instead of living under God's blessing, his favor, his smile, human beings instead began to live under his curse. That is, his anger, his judgment. And the chapters that follow in the book of Genesis unpack for us what it's like to live under the curse, under the judgment of God. So chapter 4, the first human family becomes the scene of the first human murder. Cain murders his brother Abel. And then in Genesis 5, there's a kind of family tree, a genealogy that runs through lots of generations from Adam all the way to Noah. But as you go through, there's this like ominous drumbeat every verse. Da-da-da, had this person, da-da-da, sons and daughters, and then he died. Sons and daughters, and then he died, and then he died, and then he died. All the way through Genesis 5. Things are so bad that in Genesis 6, God decides to pretty much destroy the whole human family in a huge flood and then start again just with Noah and his family. And even then, after that new startup, that kind of second startup, things very quickly turn sour. It doesn't last. The whole thing reaches a kind of grim climax in Genesis chapter 11 with the story of the Tower of Babel, where human beings use their know-how to try and make a name for themselves in defiance of God. They try and build this great tower as a monument to human achievement that will reach up to the skies, as if claiming God's place for themselves. They want to make a name for themselves. It's all pretty grim. It's as if the choice of Genesis 3 has got hardwired into the human heart, and we're determined to push God to the edge at all costs, even though the consequences are very grim. But then comes this great turnaround moment, this handbrake turn moment of Genesis chapter 12. Just have a look again at Genesis 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you." We've not seen that word bless for a very long time. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Blessing is beginning to multiply here. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. This is going global. You see what's happening? It's a dramatic moment in the Bible story. God is on the move. Curse is giving way to blessing. Darkness and despair are being overcome by light and hope. We're going to explore this little section under 4 headings. We'll go into chapter 15 as well. The first is this. We've got here the beginnings of a global plan. All nations on earth will be blessed because of you. One of my favorite little haunts when we used to live up in Nottingham in the East Midlands was a beautiful valley called Biggindale near Hartington in Derbyshire. If you know that part of the world, you may know it. It was one of our favorite walks on a Saturday. We'd walk up from the village in Hartington after our morning coffee, walk across the hill, and then you get to this place, just as you came off the top of the hill, get to this place on the other side where there was just a little dip. It was no more than 5 meters, I think, dip in the hillside. And we would walk down the 5 meters and then just turn to the right and follow this tiny little kind of apology for a valley. But after a few minutes, it began to open up. And then we'd follow it through for 20 minutes. And by the time you got to the bottom, it had fanned out into this big, dry limestone valley that was very beautiful, that just kept going and kept getting bigger and bigger until it plunged into the beautiful River Dove at the bottom. And in a similar way, Genesis 12 and the promise here, it just begins with one man and his family, with Abraham. But then it begins to open up to the nation that would come from him, the nation of Israel. And then by verse 3, it's opened up to the whole world. All the nations of the world will be blessed you. It starts so small, but it opens up into a world-changing plan that God has. A plan to bless the world, to bless the nations. Now, that's not language perhaps that we use too much. What's it about, this idea of blessing? I think in our culture today, probably the nearest that we've got to it is the idea of well-being that we talk about quite a lot, well-being. But we often use that in quite a secular sense, whereas this isn't in any sense a secular idea. Blessing in the Bible is about all of life being the way that God created it to be. All of life as God intended it. You remember last week, Andrew talked about how the choice we made back in Genesis 3 resulted in alienation from God, from other people, from creation, even from ourselves. Well, blessing is the opposite of that. Blessing is about all of life as it's meant to be, so that we're in a right relationship with God. We're in a right relationship with other human beings. We're in a right relationship with creation, and we're even at peace with ourselves. Blessing touches the whole of life. And God's promise to Abraham was that through him and his offspring, that blessing would touch the whole of the world. As we go through this promise here in Genesis 12, you'll find there are 3 dimensions to this promise of blessing, which are very important to notice. We're only just going to kind of note them today, although the children are going to be focusing on these 3. So again, parents, make sure you note these down. And what we're going to find is that these 3 actually become themes that we're following right the way through the whole of the Bible story, that kind of bind it together, okay? And they're introduced to us back here in Genesis chapter 12. The first part of God's promise to Abraham is that his family would become a nation. Verse 2, I will make you into a great nation. That's initially the nation of Israel. But this nation is going to have a very special relationship with God. I'll make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. We've already seen what that means. It's a relationship with God which changes everything, and a relationship with God which is to be shared with all the nations of the world. End of verse 3, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So we've got a nation, God's people. We've got a special relationship, God's blessing, that's going to be shared with the world. And then thirdly, there's a land, a place where God's people will live under his blessing in relationship with him, in his presence. So you've got those 3, God's people, living under God's blessing, which they're to share with the world, living in God's place, the place of his presence. Have you got that? God's people, God's blessing, God's place. We're going to say those together because we're going to come back to these time and again, and they're going to help us keep our bearings all the way through the great Bible story. What have we got? God's people, God's blessing, and God's place. Once more, God's people, God's blessing, and God's place. And with our eyes closed, God's people, God's blessing, and God's place. Now, you may not be convinced that God even exists, or you may have all kinds of ideas about God, and that's fine. That's part of being in dialogue together. But I want you just to imagine for a moment that God does exist, and that God has a plan. What would it be like to know what that plan is? To know what God is actually doing in the world? What would it mean for you, for your life? I want to suggest to you, it would be quite revolutionary. It would mean that you knew where history was heading. It would mean that you knew how to avoid a wasted life because you could line your life up with what God's plan was. It would mean that you could therefore find the meaning and purpose for your life that all of us, I think, are looking for. Well, here it is. Right at the beginning of the Bible, here is God's great plan for the whole of history. The world is in a mess because we are in a mess. That much is obvious enough. But God's going to do something about it. He's going to bless this one family. The family will become a nation, the people of Israel. There'll be a people living in a land under God's blessing, a kind of working model of what life is like when God's involved. And through that nation, all of the nations of the world are going to be put right, are going to be blessed. A global plan for the whole of creation to be recreated, to be put right, for the mess to be sorted out and healed. That's what God is doing right from the beginning of the Bible story. So what we're going to be doing over the coming weeks, we'll be looking through the rest of the Bible story to see, okay, how is this plan fulfilled? Where is this people that God is bringing into relationship with himself? What is their relationship with him like? How do they nurture that relationship so that they live this blessed life that they can pass on to other people? Where is the land that he's going to give them to live in? What does it mean to live in his presence? How can people who are flawed live in the presence of a God who is perfect? How does that work? We're going to see how the plan unfolds all the way through. But what is already clear, just from what we've seen in the last couple of minutes, is that being part of that plan isn't just about expecting God to run his universe for our maximum convenience. Isn't that kind of the way a lot of us think about what it means to be in relationship with God? It means kind of he'll look after us, everything will go fine, and generally, if we need a parking space, it will be there for us. And, he'll look after us. Things won't go wrong. And we'll have this lovely, blessed, favored life. Well, it isn't that simple. Right from the beginning, to be in a right relationship with God wasn't just about having a lovely time for you to kind of, enjoy for yourself. Right from the beginning, it was about being part of his plan to change the world. He blesses us to make us a blessing. God's blessing is not to be hoarded with selfishness, but to be shared with generosity. And when we do, we will change the world. That's what Genesis 12 is telling us. A global plan. Second, we've got an unlikely people. Now just turn over a page to Genesis 15. We've not read this chapter, but we'll just explore it for a few minutes. I wonder if you saw that film Ocean's 11 a few years back. It's a film where an ex-prisoner, Danny Ocean, which is where the name comes from, violates his parole and then assembles this very kind of random-looking collection of people, many of whom, to be honest, look like no-hopers, but who then manage to pull off a simultaneous raid of 3 casino vaults at the same time and walk off with $160 million, which isn't bad for a day's work, is it? It's perhaps not the ideal film for teaching morality to your teenage kids, but I remember watching it and thinking at the beginning that this just looked like a bunch of losers who didn't stand a chance of carrying off the plan that they had. But of course, the drama of the film is that somehow they do. Reading the rest of the book of Genesis feels a little bit like that to me sometimes. You kind of look at these characters, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and you find yourself thinking, why on earth is God getting himself involved with people like that? I mean, to be honest, they're a bit of a mess. Abraham lies about his wife pretending to be his sister. He does it twice, and then he has a child by his house servant. His son Isaac lies about his wife too. And then Isaac's son Jacob deceives his father and steals his brother's birthright. Jacob's family is torn apart by favoritism and jealousy. I mean, it's a mess. What's God doing getting involved with people like that? But then, of course, it begins to turn around, doesn't it? And you think, well, actually, if God gets involved with such unlikely people, he might just get involved with me as well, because I'm a bit of a mess too. Actually, right from the start of this story, Abraham looked about the most unlikely person you could imagine to be the father of a world-changing nation. Because Abraham had a profound problem. This one wasn't his fault, but he had a profound problem. He was already way past the age of bearing children, and he had no children of his own. So how on earth was he going to have an offspring that was going to change the world? It seemed, well, not just unlikely, it seemed impossible. And he was angry with God about it. Have a look at Genesis 15, verse 1. After this, Abraham had just done some rather heroic things, but we'll leave that for now. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield, your very great reward. You'd hope Abraham would say, wow, that's great. But no. Verse 2, Abraham said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abraham said, you've given me no children, and so a servant in my household will be my heir. You can feel his pain, can't you? You can feel his anger. Some of us perhaps here know some of what that feels like. But God spoke to this old, hurting, angry man with a dramatic promise. Verse 4, the word of the Lord came to him. This man, your servant, will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. God took Abraham outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to them, so shall your offspring be. Doesn't that just seem so unlikely? So impossible? A childless man, probably about 80 by now, promised an offspring so huge that you couldn't count them any more than you can count the stars in the sky. Unlikely, absolutely unlikely. And yet, it happens. The nation of Israel was born. And through them, a vast global family of faith from all the nations. And so often this seems to be God's way. He uses the most unlikely people to accomplish his plans. Why? Well, at least one reason is so that it's obvious to everyone that it's his work and not theirs. Who would have thought that a couple of hotheads running the family fishing business, a corrupt civil servant, a terrorist sympathizer, a compulsive pessimist and skeptic would join with half a dozen other friends and change the world in a generation? But that's what Jesus' disciples were, and that's what Jesus' disciples did. Unlikely people. And God wove them into his plan to change the world. And I think it means for us that whatever our backgrounds, whatever our setbacks and disappointments, whatever our struggles and weaknesses and failures, however unlikely we may feel, any of us can be a part of God's great plan to put things right if we put our trust in Jesus and start to follow him. A global plan in which unlikely people have a part to play. But then an unexpected path. This is to do with how we find our way into that plan. I think I'll never forget one Sunday morning, about a year ago, when I had the privilege of not being in here for the service, but out the back there in the lounge, sitting in, helping out with the More to Life group. I don't very often do it, but just occasionally I do, and it's always fun. But I remember Kev Lyons, who was sitting just over there a few minutes ago, one morning in More to Life. Many of us are praying for Kev at the moment because his health is in such a bad way. But he's a lovely guy, and I remember him leaning back in his chair, folding his arms, and saying to me in his own kind of deep, husky voice, he said, you know, John, I've decided it all boils down to this. Is God's favor something we earn through what we do for him? Or is it something we receive as a free gift through what Jesus has done for us? Isn't that fantastic? I lived on that for a few weeks. It all boils down to this. Is God's favor something we earn through what we do for him, or something we receive as a free gift through what Jesus has done for us? He was spot on with that question. See, we human beings, we have this deep instinct that religion is about us proving ourselves to God and earning his favor through our good works so that eventually he's kind of pretty much obliged to look after us and do us good. It's getting into God's good books by the stuff we do. And that instinct goes so deep in the human heart. But it's a route to disaster. It's a route to insecurity and despair, because we will never match the standards of God's total perfection and purity. It's a pipe dream. It isn't worth shooting for at all. Never. No, our only hope is that because of his great love for us, God will do something for us. And the great story of the Bible is that he has done something for us. That's what this plan is all about. And all he asks of us is that we humble ourselves before him and receive what he offers as a free gift. That's the unexpected path of biblical faith. Not brownie points with God, but the outstretched empty hand of faith to receive what he offers for free. So with Abraham here in this story, there's no hint that he was some great virtuous person who was so virtuous that he attracted God's attention and God said, well, there's someone I'm going to look after. No, God just steps into his life. He takes the initiative. He makes the promises. We've just seen that astonishing promise of this huge offspring that's going to bless the world. What's Abraham's role? What does he have to do? Chapter 15, verse 6. Abraham believed the Lord. He trusted what God said. Abraham believed the Lord. And God credited it to him as righteousness. In other words, God said, that's enough. Just trust me. That's enough. Wow. Righteousness here means being in a right relationship with God. And Abraham is brought into this right relationship with God simply through trusting that God would do what he said he would do and receiving the gift God offered. And for us too, this is the unexpected path into a right relationship with God. I know it might do your pride better to feel that you could earn your way into God's good books. I know that might make you feel better, but it isn't the path of the Bible. The path of the Bible is that is a dead end. We will never do it. But the good news of the Bible is that Jesus has done everything that's necessary to bring us into that right relationship with God. All he asks of us is to extend the empty hand of faith and receive. Jesus died on the cross to take the punishment for all the wrong stuff in our lives so that we can be forgiven and set free. We just have to say, yes, please, Lord. Do that for me. It's what Kev discovered. It's what is helping Kev now through the challenges of his illness. And it's what you can discover too if you've not yet put your trust in Jesus. An unexpected path, the path of faith. And this is kind of underlined for us in the final, rather unusual section, which I'm calling unconditional promise. I'll read a bit of it to you in a moment, but it is a bit strange. Let me put it in context for a second. The Bible's word for promise is often the word covenant. And that's a quite important word that we'll come back to many times in the Bible story, the word covenant. It is a promise, but it's more than a promise. A covenant is a relationship that is based on a promise, rather like the relationship of marriage, where that relationship of faithfulness and commitment is based on the promises and vows that we make to one another with witnesses on the wedding day. That's a kind of covenant. And in the Bible, God makes covenants with people. He establishes a relationship with people which is based on promises that he has made to them, just as he's made these promises with Abraham here. So you can see the word covenant in verse 18 of chapter 15. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants, I give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. I won't read all of the name details there. God makes his covenant, his promise with Abraham. It's a promise which includes the land, but actually it's wider because there's a promise there of descendants as well, isn't it? So this covenant really is about the whole thing. God's people, God's land, God's place, and the blessing in which they would live. And God establishes this promise through what's called a covenant. But this covenant is then confirmed in what to us seems a rather bizarre way. Just have a look at verse 9. The Lord said to Abraham, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Okay, so you've got to imagine you've got these 3 animals. They're, of course, dead. They're then divided in 2, and the 2 sets of halves are laid out in 2 rows, okay? You're looking as if this is bizarre. To us, it looks bizarre, but this is the way that covenants were made in the ancient world. Literally, you didn't make a covenant, you cut a covenant. That's what the language is, because of this ceremony. And then what normally happened was the 2 people that were making the covenant would walk together down the row between the parts of the animal. And as they did that, what they were saying is, if I break this solemn promise that I've made, may what's happened to these animals happen to me. May I be broken in half if I break this covenant. That was what the ceremony was all about. Well, Abraham cuts the animals, he lays them out in half, and so you expect that God and Abraham will walk down between the 2 parts of the animals together, the 2 rows of the animals. But that isn't what happens. Instead, have a look at verse 17. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking brazier, that's a kind of fire pot, with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And on that day, the Lord made his covenant with Abraham. What's that about? Well, the fire pot is representative of the presence of God. So often in the Old Testament, God's presence is associated with burning fire. And so the fire pot that goes down the row between the pieces is a symbol of God himself walking through the pieces. But here's the key thing. He walks between the pieces of the animals alone. Just God. Abraham isn't there. Just God. What's he saying? He's saying that he takes sole responsibility for fulfilling the covenant. It's an unconditional promise. This plan, it's going to happen. And God is going to make sure it happens. But he's also saying, as he looks down the timeline, that if there comes a point where Abraham and his offspring make a mess of this relationship and shatter this covenant, who is it that will be broken? It's God himself who will be broken when the covenant is broken. When did that happen? It happened when God came and walked among us in the person of Jesus Christ and went to the cross with all our sin and failure on his shoulders, where he was broken for our brokenness, where he was torn in two for our disobedience, where the punishment that would bring us peace rested on him. so that we could be healed. Jesus took the blame. He paid the cost. He was broken. Can you see how wherever we go in the Old Testament, we're finding pictures of Jesus there? Here's another, and we're going to find lots more as the story goes through. But the wonderful thing is that it means that rebellion and failure don't have to have the last word in our lives. God and his kindness, his grace can, because God has made this unconditional promise to put everything right. And he's taken the blame for all the mistakes we've made. Have you received what he's offered? Chuck Colson was known as the hatchet man for US President Nixon, whose presidency, of course, ended in the scandal of Watergate. Colson admitted that for the first 4 decades of his life, he, quotes, had no moral compass. And he ended up in prison for obstruction of justice as one of the key architects of the Watergate scandal. But shortly before his arrest and his trial, Colson called his old friend Tom Phillips, hoping to get a bit of legal work to help with the family coffers. But Phillips had just become a Christian. And he spoke to Colson with passion about how Jesus had turned his life around. And he read to Colson from C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, and prayed for him before he left, that God would open Chuck's heart and show him the light and the way. That same night, Chuck Colson became a Christian. And with the help of a small circle of Christian friends who stuck by him, Chuck Colson's life was transformed. He went from a man with no moral compass to a man who would share the good news of Jesus with thousands of prisoners throughout America, and who would significantly shape thinking in the US on prison reform, restorative justice, and rehabilitation of offenders. You could not think of a more unlikely person for God to use. It's hard to imagine a more dramatic handbrake turn. But God is the God of handbrake turns. He did it for Slavko as well. A God who takes the most unlikely people, turns them around, brings them into relationship with himself, and then uses them to go and bless the world. He did it for Abraham and his family. He did it for Chuck Colson. He's done it for many of us here today. We're going to hear more in real lives this week about others that he's done it for. And he can do it for you. But will you ask him? Will you put your trust in Jesus and join his plan to change the world? Let's pray together before we sing. Thank you so much, Lord Jesus, that you are the God who changes lives. Thank you for what you did on the cross to take away all our failure and guilt and bring us forgiveness. And thank you that when we come to know you, you invite us into the great adventure of sharing in your plans to bring your hope to all the nations of the world. Help every one of us here to find our place within that plan, to put our trust in you, to let you turn us around so that instead of working against you, we are working with you and for you to bring your hope to a dying world. In Jesus' name, amen.